Hi there, and welcome to episode number 0 of Chicagoland. I'm your host, Xavier, and this is a short introduction for the podcast to get you acquainted with the show concept. Chicagoland is a quote-unquote video podcast examining the geographic history of Chicago and the Midwest, and I'm really excited to share it with you. Let's start with the show name. For the purposes of this show, there are 2 different Chicagolands. One is Chicagoland, 2 words, which is the name of this podcast. The other is Chicagoland, 1 word, which is a nickname for the Chicago metropolitan area. If you've lived in Chicago, or especially in the suburbs around Chicago, you're probably familiar with this definition. It's a marker of shared identity among the diverse people inhabiting the urban neighborhoods, railroad suburbs, and expressway subdivisions that surround Chicago proper. Its ubiquity in advertising, billboards, newspaper ads, TV commercials, points to economic and cultural ties that loosely unite the whole metropolitan area. As a matter of fact, typing Chicagoland into Wikipedia redirects you to the article Chicago Metropolitan Area. And thanks to the dictates of the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, we know for certain that the Chicago Metropolitan Statistical Area comprises Cook, DuPage, Will, Grundy, Kendall, Kane, DeKalb, McHenry, and Lake counties in Illinois, as well as Porter, Lake, Newton, and Jasper counties in Indiana. Or, if you want an even more expansive definition, use the Chicago Combined Statistical Area, which lumps together the aforementioned counties alongside LaPorte County, Indiana, Kenosha County, Wisconsin, and finally, Kankakee, LaSalle, Putnam, and Bureau counties in Illinois. But are these official federal definitions the same thing as Chicagoland? Certainly they have the ring of authority, but keep in mind government maps are a means to an end, a taxonomy devised by a massive administrative state to manage its subjects. Existing counties are the fundamental building block of statistical areas. They're joined together based on where people happen to travel to work. Suburban and rural counties simply get agglomerated into whichever nearby urban core county draws the most commuters. The idea that suburbs are defined by those residents who commute daily into the city continues to hold some salience, but it's far from a complete explanation of the Chicagoland concept. After all, any community has residents who don't travel for work, whether they work remotely, freelance, and/or provide childcare. There are numerous economic and cultural ties that we might examine to build a clearer picture of the Chicago region. For example, a 1937 graduate thesis by Lewis Copeland included some 100 maps charting out the geographical relationships of various types of cultural groups, sporting events, businesses, and yes, transportation links. Although Copeland's maps are 100 years out of date, they ably illustrate many of the intangible qualities of any metropolitan region. Just as Copeland's maps suggest, the original definition of the term Chicagoland stemmed from a combination of economic and cultural relationships. It included not only the immediate Chicago metropolitan area, but also a sprawling domain across the Midwest. The name Chicagoland was coined by retired Army colonel and publishing magnate Robert R. McCormick. Robert was the owner of the Chicago Tribune newspaper, as well as a grandnephew and inheritor of the Cyrus McCormick estate. He was the millionaire founder of the McCormick Mechanical Reaper Company. By the 1920s, the Trib was one of Chicago's biggest newspapers, and it was championing McCormick's reactionary strain of republicanism, bigotry, isolationism, and Red Scare anti-communism. But McCormick dreamed yet bigger. Chicago was clearly the dominant city in the Midwest, so why shouldn't the Tribune itself be the dominant newspaper in the Midwest? So it was under the auspices of McCormick's expansion program that journalist James O'Donnell Bennett was sent out across the Midwest to write about the multitudinous cities and towns. Places like Dubuque, Moline, Peoria, and Kankakee. Each visit became the subject of an ongoing column in the Chicago Tribune newspaper. The title of that series? Chicagoland. The subheading of the first article in the series read, Our Own Midwest, Scenic and Historic, Revealed. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. Smaller urban areas across the Midwest received a regional spotlight, pleasing local boosters and civic leaders. In return, McCormick hoped that residents of these towns would start thinking of themselves as denizens of Chicagoland, and therefore, readers of the Chicago Tribune. With or without McCormick's Tribune, though, there was another really important reason why many Midwesterners might have geographically imagined themselves in relation to Chicago, that being the railroads. Most of the country's major railroads terminated in downtown Chicago. Therefore, any city or decent-sized town in, say, Indiana, Iowa, or Wisconsin was nearly guaranteed to have a direct train to Chicago, making it the economic and cultural center of gravity for the Midwest and beyond. My hometown still has a train to Chicago, even though St. Louis is much closer geographically. So, why were the railroad lines built to converge on Chicago rather than any other city? Geography. Chicago was built at a harbor on the south end of Lake Michigan. That gave it access to Great Lakes shipping, as well as proximity to natural resources to the north and west. Finally, Chicago is one of the few locations with a portage where a tributary of the Mississippi River gets really close to the Great Lakes watershed. Pretty soon after the city's founding, a short canal over flat land soon connected Chicago to a vast network of waterways stretching east to New York and south all the way down to the Gulf Coast. Chicago's navigational access made it the perfect economic center for the 19th century. The railroads were the vehicle for the United States' transformation from a colonial backwater into the world's industrial powerhouse. Simply put, the emergence of the modern United States was built on the extraction of natural resources out of the environment on a mind-boggling scale. In just a few decades, the tallgrass prairies were plowed over, the northern forests were clear-cut, and the bison were exterminated. Massive amounts of coal, iron, stone, lumber, grain, and meat needed to be consolidated, processed, and distributed across the continent and beyond. As the scale of resource extraction escalated, more and more goods were carried on trains. Western railroads funneled resources into Chicago, where they were sold, and Eastern railroads channeled them to New York, where they were dispersed across Europe and the East Coast. A single, centrally located trading hub delivered the largest economies of scale for both traders and shippers. Which brings us back to the title of this show. Chicagoland, that's 2 words, remember, is more than just the city of Chicago and its immediate surroundings. Like McCormick's original Chicagoland concept, my Chicagoland is geographically expansive, perhaps even more so. Chicagoland is the entire system of natural features, economic production, and policy choices that shape the North American continent. It's culturally and economically comprehensive. Rocks, soils, forests, grasslands, waterways, streets, railroads, agriculture, factories, sacred sites, and shopping centers. Everything is fair game. Now that I'm all fired up, I get to tell you how the show Chicagoland works. Each week, I'll research a topic, write about it, and invite a colleague onto the show to get a dialogue going. You can expect a new episode each week with a runtime somewhere around 45 to 50 minutes. Often a topic will take multiple episodes to get through, in which case I'll divide it up into however many parts are needed. Because Chicagoland is a quote-unquote video podcast, I'm mainly formatting it for YouTube, which is where you'll be able to see the maps and visuals I've prepared. But there's nothing stopping you from listening to just the audio. Chicagoland will be available on your podcast platform of choice, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and probably a few others. And if you want even more Chicagoland, or if you just want to support my work, you can do that through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Chicago_land. It's just $5 a month, and it gets you 2 extra bonus episodes each month. I'm putting a lot of work into this show, and I'll only be able to keep going with support from listeners like you. That's it for this mini episode. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you next time. You've been listening to Chicagoland, a production by Articulata Publishing. Chicagoland is written, edited, and produced by Xavier. The Chicagoland theme was composed by Chris Robbin. That's ChrisRobbin.